first one is about your application structure or the general layout. There are a few things, a few conventions Flow will impose on you. For example, where to put your fluid files so they are recognized automatically. But the rest of your application is mostly free to do whatever you like with namespaces, etc. However, I can give some recommendations how to structure your application. So this would be a folder structure from a demo application. And this is the folder below classes, or this is the classes folder of your application. And I want to mention a few of these folders. Starting not at top, but with the most common part, you have the controller folder. You probably also know that you can have subfolders in there. In your routing, you can define subpackage keys. Also, your controller name you specify in your routing can have slashes. So with that, you are able to address controllers which are in subfolders of this controller folder. And that makes sense, especially if you have a bigger application, to structure your controllers by topic or by parts of your application. One other point which Pankaj already mentioned is that it makes sense in many cases to have one or more base controllers where you would initialize your view. So for example, a very common way to display a menu on every page, if you do that manually, is to create an initialize view method in a base controller and then extend from that in all of your action controllers. But that is probably the part you're most at home already, the whole controller part. The same probably goes for the domain part. And so in the keynote this morning, Stefan Priebsch told you about the different ways how you can implement MVC or how to call it MVC at all. And you know that Flow has this strong focus on domain-driven design. So we try to distinguish between application logic, which controls the flow of your application and all the infrastructural concerns, and the domain, that is the business logic. So you see domain model, and then you have your models there. You see domain repository, where you have the corresponding repositories. But you also see domain service. And there are two kinds of services you can practically have, at least that's what I like to do. You can have domain services and you can have application services. And there's probably sometimes a very thin border between both, but you should try to put all services which are truly at home in your domain into a domain service namespace, and all the rest into the application service. So what does that mean? Why would you create a service at all? Because that's also a bad habit sometimes. If you don't know where it belongs in an application, you just create a service. Everything else goes in there. One thing Stefan also mentioned today is you should not put application logic, or any logic, basically dealing with the domain, of course, into your controller. So why is that? First of all, it is only bound to a specific type of request, so it's difficult to handle command line request and HTTP request and then do the same thing. But it also kind of obfuscates where is your business logic happening and where is the code which only deals with certain aspects of the framework or the platform. So I'll have an example for that a few slides later, but in general try to distinguish between both. And you see an application service, they have a subfolder API and V1, V2. This would be an example where I could put some API, some public API, maybe REST-based, or I could also create a SOAP service there. And this service up there only does the input validation and the handling connection and the communication with the client, but does not contain important business logic or something. They would also defer to the domain service again. So imagine, what controller do you have? You have a user controller here. So user controller allows you to create a new user. In the controller directory, you create your action controller, which displays, or which actually has the edit action, create action, just like you know from the blog example, maybe. Now, you want to create a public API and want to keep that stable for a very long time. So this is why you put a version number in it. And up there in application service API v1, you also create a controller, which is your REST controller, or your SOAP controller, or whatever. And that is just a very thin layer. And it uses the same functions like your action controller uses. So it depends really on how complex that is. If it's just creating an object and putting it into the repository, you certainly can do that right away in the action controller. But if it's a bit more, then you put that into a domain service. So you have lots of levels of indirection here, but it depends on your application. The bigger it goes, the more probable is that you want to distribute it that way. So you have one domain service which actually does whatever you want to do, and you have different very thin layers, very thin controllers in controller, in application service, etc. And of course, you see there's also a directory command where command controller is. There you also have controllers which are extremely thin, don't create a user themselves, but defer that to domain service. And so in this example you would have 3 different ways to create a user, for example, from just a regular HTML form, an API, and the CLI command. And you don't want to duplicate that logic, so you put it into a domain service. Yes, certainly.
Since both the commands and the applications are actually controllers that are handling requests, why don't you think they belong as software control?
Yeah, so why do commands and other REST services not belong to controller? I think it's partly a legacy. So maybe if we could start from scratch again, we wouldn't just call it controller, but maybe have also some directory in front, because actually in API v1 there you need a controller subdirectory in order to have controllers there, so you can point the router to it. So it's kind of yeah, not so consistent in that way. But in terms of commands, and so we would have command and maybe, yeah, do you have a good name for the other category? Yeah, no, it's, you have the API, you have the command, and then what you expose to the user. Web, yeah, thing. We could call it thing. The other. And, or just underscore, that saves a lot of time typing as well. Or use a nice white space character, which is not so often used. But you get the idea. Yeah, and then you have the other directories, for example, for routing. If you create your custom route part handler, you can put that into routing, your view helpers there. Just structure it a bit. So there's no real fancy things in here. But now that Stefan mentioned it this morning, about how does MVC work, and we had this nice play here. I wanted to give you a quick reminder into how the request-response model works in Flow, so you can relate to what Stefan said this morning. So I'll give you a very quick tour through what happens. HTTP request comes in, goes through the framework, and the response comes out again. You'll see a lot of code in this tour. So, MVC. We start with the index PHP, and in some of these code examples I have removed a few unnecessary lines which would only hurt your eyes. So, this is basically the index PHP. It gets the context for Flow from an environment variable, and then creates a new bootstrap instance and runs that bootstrap instance. Someone, I think it was Thomas, where you were not allowed to set the environment variable in your project. Remember the context? Yeah. And you put it into an htaccess file. If you can set an environment variable and don't want to have the overhead of an htaccess file, I think it's completely fine to modify the index.php file and hardcode or do some other logic you want to do there, because this is just a file consisting of, I don't know, 6 lines of code, which you never really change, so it's completely fine to hardcode something there. Then you are in the run method of the bootstrap. And actually, there's nothing else happening before. So you see, we initialize the class loader, the signal slot system, and the package management. This is very, very few happening there. And then we try to find a request handler. So a request handler is built in Flow. We have an HTTP request handler, of course, but you can create your very own request handler. And this mechanism allows you to hook into the boot process extremely early. You can imagine that initializing the class loader, signal slot, and package management doesn't take so long. So at this point, you already can take over control completely and do some very specific request handling, if you like. So if you compare it to Type 3, the EID mechanism, kind of, that is kind of similar, but it's much earlier in the whole boot process. So this would be the HTTP request handler, and I dimmed a few lines which are not executed yet. So it creates a new HTTP request object, a new HTTP response object, and then I put the running of the boot sequence of Flow into an additional method, this boot. So Flow initializes lots of parts of itself, so localization, persistence, security, everything. And all these initialization steps are formed into a boot sequence. But you can remove steps from the sequence or add your own steps into the sequence. Of course, you need to know what you do, because there are lots of interdependencies. So if you remove persistence but try to have caching framework based on persistence, that's difficult, and some other things. But still, you have full control over it. And now we need to transform the HTTP request into some internal request. And that is kind of the input mapping Stefan talked about. So we try to get the raw data from outside with query parameters, or a post request has some arguments in its body. Now we put it into, or transform it into some action request. Action request object is contains the information which package contains the controller I need to call now, which controller, what is the name of the controller I need to call, what is the name of the action I need to call, and which arguments should I pass to that action. So that is basically the information which is contained in an action request. So internally we only work with action requests. And the nice thing is that you can have a hierarchy of requests, so you can have one controller accepting this action request and then decides that it needs to invoke other subcontrollers. And the communication in this case works with action requests. So who is responsible for getting that information? Which controller is responsible? And that's the routing system. So you see that we're setting the route's configuration, and then we ask the router to create an action request out of with the information you have in the HTTP request. So this is where we get an action request back. Then we set the context for security framework, and then the dispatcher takes over. The dispatcher creates a loop. This is the dispatcher being called. So there's a while loop. While this action request is not dispatched, run the controller and action which is stored in this action request. So usually this loop is ended after one time, if you exactly find your the right action to call, and that does whatever it needs to do. But it could be that this action forwards a request to another controller, and the forward mechanism, where you just call this forward method, will just change the information in the action request, which controller is responsible, and then return, and then the request is not dispatched, and the loop will jump to the next controller. So we finally end up in our controller, and for example, the show action is called. There's some step I skipped here, and that was the mapping of the HTTP arguments to the action arguments that the arguments in the action request. That happens in the router. And also the whole validation part is implemented in the action controller base class, but you probably can imagine it. So we end up in this show action here, and our controllers, our action controllers, are responsible for the application flow mostly. So this action controller should decide what do I need to do, which information do I want to show, and in this case it already gets the model through the property mapping, sets it to the view, and the view is automatically rendered well. And then it goes back again to the dispatcher. By the way, every time you see something like this, emit after controller invocation, this means there's a signal which is sent, and you can hook into that signal. You could subscribe it subscribe to it like to some event. Mm-hmm. So you could create some custom code which is every time called when, for example, the controller has been executed here. And there are some other signals on the system, of course. Right. So back in the request handler, we have the response. We make that standards compliant in case you set some weird HTTP headers which don't make sense in that combination. We try to iron that out, and then send the response and shut down the whole framework. So you see that we send the response and then shut down the framework. In this shutdown sequence, we do, for example, all database queries which persist data into the database. That means the HTML is already sent to the browser, and then we start writing your data into the database. There's no need that a user needs to wait for it. And who knows why we have this exit invoke here? Because we can. So this exit is some anonymous function which only contains one line, and that is exit. So it doesn't make a lot of sense if you look at it, but it allows us to unit test this method. Because if you have a hard-coded exit in your code, it will exit, even if you run it in your unit test. But during testing, we set this exit to some anonymous function which doesn't do anything, and so we can test this method. So what is wrong with this action? From a real-world project. Not written by me, though. It's a bit... Yeah, you know the project. It's a bit large, isn't it? So this action really does too much, I think. And so it renders a PDF, and it goes a bit further like that. So this is something you really should avoid or should never do. Even if this is the only way to create a PDF, this is not the right place to render the PDF. The first thing you should do is put it into a service. For example, you could have some invoice generator service here, and then you generate the invoice and forward to the download action. It's also much better readable. And in general, however, I would not recommend generating PDFs in any service or action. I would put that into a job queue. This is really stupid to let your application do things which take a lot of time, or also sending emails, depending on how many users you have for your application, but usually try to make that asynchronous and put it into a job queue and serve the request very fast. Don't let your web server render PDFs. Right, there's one, these are the leftovers, as I said. So there's one thing I wanted to recommend in terms of forms. Basti mentioned that today. Many people don't know that there's a tutorial about how to use the form framework. There's a package called Type3 Form, which allows you to do much more fancy stuff than with the built-in Fluid Form View Helper. So we have seen also during this conference so crazy stuff made with Fluid and forms, but it's completely unnecessary. We have a whole framework for it, a form framework, and there's a tutorial with lots of examples how to use it. Then we talked about speed, and one very easy way to speed up your application is using HTTP cache control headers and Varnish. So just in case you didn't know it, in your action controller you can just access the response with this response. That is the HTTP response. And then you can set the max lifetime, max age, cache control headers, everything you like. And it makes a lot of sense in your application to think about reasonable values and set that yourself in your actions. It also makes you compatible with a new feature in Flow 2.1 or 2.2, I don't know yet, which will be the built-in reverse proxy. So we won't have a traditional page cache in NEOS like we have in Type3. We will control everything with cache control headers. That means if you create an application or plugin which uses these headers, you can use Varnish, or later on you can use the built-in Flow caching mechanism. Right. So one feature I mentioned in the keynote, one of the last-minute features was the safe request handling, or safe request method handling. And we also have method tunneling, but I just see I forgot to put in the example for the tunneling. Anyway, so just to recap on that, a safe request method, this is my personal copy of the RFC 2616, which I usually have under my pillow. there in this RFC 2616, which is the HTTP 1.1 specification, there's a section about safe methods. And it says, in particular, the convention has been established that the get and head methods should not have the significance of taking an action other than retrieval. These methods should be considered safe. And we thought, well, it's written in this law, let's just implement it in Flow. It will break a lot of applications probably, but following this advice, or this should clause here, has a lot of advantages. Because if you know that that an operation cannot change anything, you can also configure your framework differently. You could prepare everything for read-only access. You don't have to initialize so many parts in the framework. So that's what you have to watch out. Now if you upgrade to 2.0, also if you almost have been on master recently, remember that we don't have automatic persistence anymore. That means if you have a GET request, the persist all method of the persistence measure won't be called anymore. However, if you need to, you can do that on your own. So if you have a very good reason to make some changes, then you can inject the persistence manager called persist all in your action, and that will work. One feature we changed in that process, and many people will like that, is the CSRF handling. Who knows what it protects against? Because I met more people knowing about the CSRF token, but not knowing what it actually does. So who knows what it does? Okay, yes, and it's kind of 2/3. So CSRF stands for cross-site request forgery, and it's an attack which is quite simple. So it says, I cannot hack into your application and do run the delete method, but what I can do is I can send you an email, or by some other way send you a link, and if you are logged in with the necessary rights and click that link, you will delete something, for example. And there are very easy ways to obfuscate that. Of course, you could, for example, use a URL shortener, just send that link in a tweet, click it, poof. But there are even more easy ways. You can actually prepare a website which clicks that link fully automatic for you. You don't even have to click your mouse to execute the link. So it's really a critical thing. It usually happens though if someone knows which application you're using, of course. So to protect against this attack, we usually added some tokens. So consider this link here, which deletes a book. And in order to protect this, we created a token which was added as a get parameter. So this token here, or not this specific one, but a similar one, is a hash over your session ID and some shared or some secret on the server, which means that the delete action will only be executed if you're still logged in with that session the token was created for. And that makes it much harder to send you a link, because someone would have to have the information about your session ID and the secret on the server, and then while you're still logged in, send you that link. But if he knows probably this information, he can also just log in probably. However, this had a big drawback, and that is if you now... So these links are generated for all actions which are protected by policy. And the stupid thing is, for example, the invoice controller show action is also protected by policy, but it doesn't do any harmful thing. So in that case, we wouldn't need CSRF protection. because yeah, then he sends you that links and then you see the invoice. There's nothing, no harm done. But now that we have safe requests, we know that a GET request cannot do any harm, so we don't need to protect it anymore. And that means we don't generate CSRF tokens for links anymore. For if you use the URI builder or the link view helper, we won't attach a CSRF token. We only add it to forms, and even in forms is now not part of the URL anymore, but a hidden field in that form. And now you can actually copy that link pointing to an invoice and send it to someone who also has access rights to log in. Previously, you just couldn't do that because it was your CSRF token. So if someone else would use it, even if they are logged in, they would get some access denied exception. And another big profit we got from it is speed, because every time we generate a link, we had to run through the AOP framework and the security framework and use cryptographic methods to generate that token for you and edit, etc. And that was really slow. And now link generation is much, much faster. Right. Okay, so there's a question from Dante. Yeah.
What about this CSRF and IX goes maybe is there some way to pull these CSRF tokens?
Yeah, so the question was what to do with Ajax calls, for example. How can you get the CSRF token yourself? Do you want to answer? Yeah. Oh, you can also answer.
Do we have an answer?
Yeah, I have a very simple answer.
Okay,
just inject the security context, and then you can call a method get CSRF token or something.
So I just talked to Bastian and I said him we should deliver a view helper that you can add to your header that prints a meta tag with a CSRF token, and then in your JavaScript you can just read it from the meta tag. So it's,
yeah.
So because it's very common that you need it.
Yeah, that would be much easier. But there's some API method you can call, and then you get the token. And at least now you could create your own view helper for the time being, if we didn't do that already. Yeah, the hidden fields with the CSRF token are created automatically by the form view helper, and the type3 form package extends the form view helper, so it's also included there. Yeah?
Maybe one thing to add. Maybe it's obvious to you, but just in case you have an application and you have these bad delete links, and you realize now it doesn't work anymore, so remember you can do it yourself by calling persist all. You shouldn't, because, or at least then you should know that disables CSRF protection, which Robert just said, but instead you should just work around this and create a little form, or if you really need a link, then at least there's some ways where you can change the get link to a post request via JavaScript. So that would be the way to go. Never do changing requests with get. That's just bad, because actually Google or any search engine is allowed to follow all your get links, obviously, and the only reason why we usually
type of versions, I remember that.
Yeah, the only reason why usually Google doesn't delete all your books is because they usually the delete links are behind some login, but otherwise Google would just click them and follow them.
So if you create a wiki, for example, which doesn't require login, that would be not so good to use a delete link there. We had that in some the built-in plugins in Type3 in the very, very beginning, that we were losing content all the time. Okay, so another feature which I would like to show you, because you need to know about is lazy dependency injection. I don't remember. Did I tell in the keynote why we have that? No. Yes? Oh. Yeah, then you know it already. But it's about speed, obviously. So, but you need, it doesn't hurt to know a bit of the internals, how that is implemented, so you can use it the right way. Lazy dependency injection only works for property injection. So you have class, constructor injection, setter injection, and we have proper injection. So you just use the inject annotation. This is, by the way, also the fastest way to use dependency injection in Flow. Because, so this internally, which you will see in a second, is just this book repository equals object manager get book repository operation, which is really fast. So we don't want to load all the classes which are somewhere in the application unless we need them. So this is why we have lazy dependency injection. Imagine you have that action controller with 15 dependencies. In your show action you need only one of these, and it would be stupid to load all these classes and never use them. So what we want to achieve is, in this action for example, this book repository should, before using it, be just a proxy which is sleeping there, waiting for you to be used. And then as soon as you use it, this book repository should contain the real book repository object. So how to do that? For that, we need some nice feature of PHP, which are anonymous functions, or closures as well. We need this kind of function. So you probably also know it from JavaScript. We create a new function on the fly, which accepts a parameter in this case, and that is stored in a variable. So, and then you can just, the short notation would be $greet, and then you pass the argument. You have seen in the previous example in the Bootstrap where I was using the exit call. It's a weird thing in PHP. If you don't have any arguments, yeah. So if you don't have any arguments in your anonymous function, then you cannot use this notation for some reason. You need to call underscore invoke, otherwise it won't be invoked. Maybe it's different in PHP 5.4.12 or 11.5. They sometimes change that on the way. Okay, we need that. And let's take a look into the proxy class of your book controller. So I removed a few lines. So you see, book controller extends your original book controller, and in the constructor it will call this flow proxy inject properties, which will automatically inject all the properties you have in your class. So far so good? Yeah, that's easy. Now this is the method which is being called. And you really don't need to understand it if you don't want to and are too tired already, but still, if you're interested in how it works, here's how it works. We're in the book controller. So I create a new variable book repository reference and put this book repository, which is currently null, into that variable by reference. So that means, even though it's no object or something, we now have a pointer exactly to this property in this class or in this object instance. Okay? And first I try to see if the book repository has been already injected somewhere in any other class. But in the, if it hasn't, you see the second case. If this book repository equals null, Then we ask the object manager to create a new lazy dependency object. And we pass a hash and this reference variable which points to the book controller's book repository variable and declare which class we want to have injected there, into there. And then we have an anonymous function here which will return the real book repository. So these are the arguments we pass to this dependency proxy. So far probably it doesn't make sense to you, but now let's look again at the action. Now if you call the findAll method, what happens now? This book repository does not contain a book repository. In fact, it contains an instance of dependency proxy. And this is a part of the dependency proxy. If you call the findAll method, this magic call method over there will take over. And this magic call method will call this activate dependency and passes the arguments and the method name of the original method, which will be findAll and no arguments. And down below, can you see that from behind? There's the activate dependency. So we try to get the real dependency, and the real dependency is now generated by the closure we created in the proxy class, which fetches the real dependency from the object manager. And by this invoke call, we now get a real book repository. So real dependency now contains a real book repository. Then we iterate over any other property variables in other classes which also need a book repository. And then you see down there, property variable equals real dependency. So property variable is this by reference variable which points directly into the internals of these objects. Usually, I mean, the problem was you cannot just set a property within a class and if that property is protected. But if you create that variable by reference and pass it around, you have a secret pointer into that object. See? And then finally we return the real dependency and call the original findAll method. And now if you call it a second time here findAll, then the whole dependency proxy is gone, and you have the real book repository in this variable, even if it would be in the next line. So why did I tell you that? The first thing is it doesn't hurt to know about closures, and the second thing is there are some very rare occasions when you need to know if it's still the dependency proxy or if it's already the real thing. Usually in a class like the book controller, if you need a book repository, you just inject it. And that is what you should do. But now if you would pass that book repository to another method in a different service or something, and use a type hint, which requires a book repository, this won't work because you're passing around a dependency proxy properly. And you have a few ways what you can do. So you can check if this book repository instance dependency proxy, then you know, okay, this is still a proxy. And you can call the underscore activate dependency, where was it? Here. The activate dependency method. That's public API and you're allowed to call it. So with that you can activate a dependency without actually calling a method on it. And there's another useful public API method which is called underscore get class name. Yes? Yes, so if the dependency proxy already has been replaced by the real thing, there's no activate dependency method anymore, so that will cause a fatal error. So before you can call it, you must check if it's an instance of dependency proxy. And a nice helper method is get class name, also with an underscore. With that, it's possible to ask the dependency proxy what class name would you be if you would be the real thing, and you don't have to invoke it. And that helps in some cases to, you know, just make sure, does it make sense to invoke you or not? And this change has really, especially for big applications, huge impact. And I showed it to Stefan Priebsch this afternoon and said, I've never seen such a pattern. Okay, some more words about accounts. You know that, oh, yeah. To us again. Ah, exactly. Okay, so if, yeah, so if you already know that this class will be, once it will be used, it definitely needs the book repository. Yeah, you can optimize this. And by saying I switch off lazy dependency injection for this case, I don't need this feature. And you can do that by writing flow inject in and then, oops, add false in here. Oops. So with that you disable, no, lazy, wouldn't make sense, right? Is it in quotes? Probably like that. Ah. No quotes. No quotes. Okay, no quotes. It's in the menu. And so the one thing is, if you are sure that you don't need it, then you can switch it off, but the overhead is really it's kind of not measurable. But another reason would be that you already know that you want to pass it around to some other method, and then you can also switch it off. Just a quick info about accounts and roles. You should not create account objects on your own. You should use the account factory for it. And you know that we have that distinction between accounts and party. So we don't want to mix up user data with the account data. That's an important principle because your application might need a special user role, or you feel tempted to extend account. It is probably somehow possible to extend account, but you should not try to do that. It will break. And what you should do instead is extending the party model. And we plan to make it a bit easier to work with interfaces there. But currently what you need to do is extend the party model, and then you create your very own user model which contains any other information you need. And as I said, use the account factory. That's the most convenient and safe way to create an account. Also, because if you want to set a password, then the correct hashing algorithms will be used. So don't try to set the credentials or yourself. So now what's new in Flow 2.0 is the role handling. So this is a new role definition from a policy YAML file. You see we have user, which doesn't inherit from any other role. We have manager, which inherits from user. This is like before. And editor now inherits from user end, and there you see a new notation type3.neos :editor. So roles now have namespaces support, which means if you don't add any namespace, you only refer to the local roles defined in your package. So in this case, if you would have relied on editor of Neos because it was defined there, this would break. You need to change it to type3.neos :editor. So that is one change you need to do. I think there's also migration for that, right? Do we have a settings migration for that?
We don't have a settings migration. But
no.
You will get a warning if you have conflicting names in your policy files. So if there's something that can be sort of resolved automatically, it will tell you what you need to change. But there's no migration.
Yeah.
Because it cannot know which package it could come from potentially. So
this main policy on
Sorry, I didn't hear. Yes, what?
The role definition in the main configuration without package was kicked. What's the question?
Yeah, exactly. So, yeah, another important detail. In the global configuration directory, you cannot have policies anymore, right? Carsten, I think you did that. At least no role definition. That will throw some exception. Yeah. I think, yeah, ACLs might still be possible. I'm not sure though. Why did we do that? Well, for a few reasons, but also one reason is that we now want to be able to store roles in the database. So there are a few new tables generated. One table which contains the roles, and you see up there identifier, anonymous, and everybody is always built in, and then you have type3neos administrator, type3neos editor, and type3cr administrator, and a little source hint, so this was defined in the policy. The roles you define in your policies are automatically synchronized into the database, so mirrored into the database. So you can still just update your policy YAML file, and next time the policy service will be used, it will synchronize it.
So every time when you introduce new package, you have to update your user to add those roles from this package?
No, for that, actually the doctrine migration, so if you have existing accounts with the old roles array, the doctrine migrate command, which creates these new tables, will read that information and set the new roles, update the roles for your account and put it into the join table. Into, what was it called? Flow security account roles join, yeah. So that is updated, but you should double check it. We had some, in case you had roles which were not unique, role names which were not unique, like you had administrator twice or something, that was not reliable, so you need to cross-check that.
If I can so I'm putting, for example, you have created some nice package with your roles. When I'm installing this, I have to assign those roles from this package, even if it's administrator, it's not my administrator. So to my administrators, I have to assign this additional role, like Robert something something.
Yeah, for the users, you should always use, or you must always use the fully qualified role name. Yeah.
So every time when you introduce a package, you have to extend all your users to those roles.
Yeah, but that makes sense because. Just because you have existing users that have the administrator role for the type3cr, it doesn't necessarily mean that if you install some other package, they should also have that administrator role. So actually, having those roles namespaced allows you to have administrator roles in multiple packages, and they are not sort of automatically being assigned. Because what we noticed before that, if you have looked into the Untitled 3CR package before that, we had a role name that was actually type 3CR underscore administrator, because we had already figured, oh yeah, we have two administrators, that clashes. So this namespace solves just this issue. And having to assign a role, that was always needed, and that makes sense also. Because otherwise, well, just install this package, it just contains documentation, and you do it and suddenly some roles change. It would be nice attack vectors.
Okay, I'm running out of time. I'll show you quickly 3 slides which can let you earn a full day of consultancy. Just imagine there's a company calling you, yeah, everything is so slow, and then you act like you're working for a full day and add 3 lines, like this. So imagine you have the index action, which is really slow because the books are scanned on every request and someone has to put it on the scanner, and you know, and you want to cache that. What you need for it is kind of the recipe for your homemade page cache. First thing you need in your caches YAML an entry that you want to have a new cache. So you call it the bookshop HTML cache with a string front end and a file backend, or a PDO or APC backend, what you like. And then you add some code into your index action, which checks, do I have something in the cache? Oh yeah, oh no, in the first case I don't. I find all books, assign them to the view, and then I render the view manually into the output variable and set it into the cache. And on the next hash hit, you will return the books immediately. That makes a lot of sense if you have complex data and you can use the tagging mechanism of the cache framework to automatically flush that cache. So if you're not familiar with the caching framework yet, it helps you a lot to look at the tagging feature. There's some cool stuff you can do. You also need some custom objects YAML which allows you to inject a cache. But that's, yeah, another thing. So you already asked me anything, and I put some examples on GitHub. There's my bookshop example, which I'll also use tomorrow in the workshop. If you're participating in the workshop, then your task for tonight would be to get a running flow system. It doesn't have to be master or anything, it's not so important. Actually, it would be good if it would be. And then I took that idea from Jule. I also have 2 kids to feed, so you can actually hire me for trainings. I love to come to your place if it's not too far away, and do some in-house workshop, which is quite efficient. Then I can also do some development. I learned a few lines of PHP recently. And you can read my blog. I've still been working on my blog plugin, which is also on GitHub, Neo-based. So if you want to have the same website like I want to have, then just clone that from GitHub. But there are lots of warnings that this is experimental and you shouldn't use it. At any rate, you can get in touch with me. I have the same nick on Twitter and on AppNet and all these other services, except Facebook. So thank you for listening, and good night.